Welcome to Acura. I'm James Carden, and today I'm joined by my colleague, David Speedie. Today's is a very special guest. George Beebe is the director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. George spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as director of the CIA's Russia analysis, director of the CIA's Open Source Center, and as staff advisor on Russia matters to Vice President Richard Cheney. His book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, warned how the United States and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. Prior to joining the Quincy Institute, George was vice president and director of studies at the Center for the National Interest. He and our colleague at the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, Anatol Lieven, have a new piece that made the cover of Harpers magazine titled Peace Now in Ukraine, and it was adapted from their Quincy Institute white paper that was published in February. So George, thanks so much for joining us. And I suppose current events dictate that we begin not with Ukraine, but with the Middle East. And I want to begin by quoting something a mutual friend of ours, Doug McGregor, just wrote and get your reaction. Doug writes, under the circumstances, Washington should expect Israel to employ whatever military power is at its disposal, including nuclear weapons, to destroy Iran's strategic power. Destroying Iran's underground nuclear facilities has been a goal for a very long time. Moscow, however, will not tolerate a devastating attack on Iran. So with regard to Moscow and the Middle East, might you be able to explain where Russia stands vis-a-vis the current conflict between Israel and Iran?
Well, I think the Russians have managed since the end of the Cold War to correct what was a real strategic weakness that the Soviet Union had in the Middle East. The Soviet Union for quite some time had no relations with Israel. It was not really able to advance its relations with so-called moderate Arab states, and it was more or less isolated with radical Arab states, rejectionists, and that put it, I think, at a real disadvantage in its strategic posture. And Russia, I think, has attempted to maneuver itself into a position where it has a much more even-handed role in the region. It has a balanced relationship. It's able to have very good relations with Israel. They now have normal diplomatic relations. I think for a long time, the foreign leader that had visited Vladimir Putin the most was, in fact, Netanyahu. But at the same time, Russia also has and has had strong relations with Iran, with other states that don't get along with Israel particularly well. And Russia has managed to pull off that balancing act to a great degree. Now, if you're in a situation where the threat of escalation into direct Israel-Iran war is looming, that actually interferes in Russia's ability to maintain this more even-handed posture. And I think more recently, because of Russia's needs flowing from the Ukraine war, the Russians have drawn closer to Iran. Iran's help with drone manufacturing, for example, has been an important part of Russia's war effort in Ukraine. So if push comes to shove, where will the Russians come down? I think they would probably tilt more closely to Iran than Israel in all of this. And there are other factors that play into this as well. But I don't think the Russians are very comfortable having to make that choice. I think if they had their druthers, they would rather not see the region go up in flames and force them into making some uncomfortable choices that they'd rather not have to make.
David?
Yes, George, I will revert to Ukraine if I may. And first of all, congratulations on the Harpers cover. I actually got the hard copy of the magazine before It came on over on the email circuit. So we at Acura have long lamented the inability to break into the so-called quality press. Even people like Ambassador Jack Matlock, and before him, the late great Steve Cohen. So this is most welcome. I wanted to. There's something I wanted to that seemed to me to be a bit of a contradiction, if I may. Just quote a couple of things you and Anatol say in the article. First of all, you do say that aid to Ukraine should continue, at least in the short term, quote, as a source of leverage in negotiations. But then you go on to say, evidence now suggests that there will, in fact, that they, the Ukrainians, will in fact be in a weaker position the longer the war goes on. So doesn't this 61 billion that's sort of sitting in Congress at the moment, wouldn't that just prolong the agony and make the second part of that, the second one of those quotes come to pass, that the longer the war goes on, the weaker position Ukraine will be in?
Well, yeah, and I think the argument here is that if the United States ends all aid to Ukraine now, essentially, Ukraine's not going to ever be in a position to negotiate. It's simply going to collapse, and probably more quickly than most people in the United States are anticipating. And that's not a good situation for Ukraine. Obviously, it's not a good situation for the prospects of a negotiated settlement. What it suggests is that Russia might well be in a position to dictate terms of ending this war rather than to negotiate them. And that's obviously not a good situation for Ukraine. I don't think it's a good situation for the United States. And, frankly, I don't think it's an optimum outcome for the Russians either. Because, when you're in a position like that, you get tempted to do things that might not be in your long-term best interests. So I believe a negotiated settlement in which all parties have to make some concessions, and you wind up with an outcome that nobody is particularly happy with, but at least satisfies the minimum requirements of all parties involved. That's what we ought to be aiming for. And I don't think we're likely to get there if the United States precipitously cuts off all aid to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, simply passing another aid package and not incorporating that into a broader strategic shift toward this war would also be a mistake. Mm-hmm. We have to couple continued aid to Ukraine with a diplomatic strategy for bringing this war to an end. And there has to be several parts to that strategy. One is Ukraine needs to go on defense. They simply need to recognize they're not going to recapture land that the Russians now control. What they have to focus on is making sure that Russia does not make much more progress in capturing more territory. But the other part of this is we have to be thinking about what really do we need? What are our core interests that must be protected in all of this? What can a stable settlement look like? How do the terms of an agreement in Ukraine relate to broader regional and global security concerns that we have to bear in mind in all of this? These are things that I don't think we've given a lot of thought to, and I think they're necessary parts in the strategic shift that has to take place.
I'd like to reference the Harpers article as well. You guys write, Western aid should be continued as the alternative likely to be a situation in which Russia will dictate rather than negotiate terms of settlement. Skeptics counter that if time is on Russia's side, Russia has no incentive to agree to a compromise. I have an alternative scenario that I'd like to run by you. It comes by way of Chuck Spinney, who's former military and a long time well-known critic of Pentagon. So as a kind of thought experiment, Chuck writes, what if Putin turns out to be gracious in his victory? What if he tried to let NATO up easy, as Lincoln reportedly said to Grant before Grant accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox? Grant, strategically, this kind of approach might make a lot of sense from Russia's and Europe's self-interest, because post-war Europe, particularly Germany, could be an important market for Russian natural resources, particularly energy resources. And Germany is a real economic mess that the US seems to be exploiting. So you have any thoughts on that?
So the alternative scenario would be that Russia's terms for a settlement might be more generous than we anticipate right now.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that's far-fetched. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Putin will settle for nothing less than Ukraine's complete destruction, its erasure from the map, and NATO's complete demise. And I certainly don't think that the first is something that the Russians intend. I don't think they're capable of it. I think militarily, to conquer all of Ukrainian territory and try to govern it is just an impossibility from Russia's point of view. It would require an occupying force many multiples the size of the invasion force they now have. They'd have to be trying to govern very hostile territory. And I'm sure that the United States and Europe would do their best to make sure there would be a very robust and active Ukrainian resistance movement that the Russians would have to contend with for many, many years to come. And the Russians know this. They're not dumb. Trying to, occupy Galicia and pacify it is not something that they relish. So that's not very likely. Now, the next question is, would Putin aim towards some sort of broader European security arrangement that would enable détente between Russia and the West, some sort of, normalization of diplomacy and economic discourse? I think the answer to that would be, in principle, I don't think the Russians would be opposed to that at all. In fact, I think they might like that idea. There's a lot in it for Russia were they able to pull something like that off. But I do think they're deeply skeptical that the West has any interest in that at all. We oftentimes talk about Putin as someone that can't be trusted. Why would we make a deal with him? He would only use that as a breathing spell to strengthen Russia for yet another attack in some way on Ukraine or the West. Well, the Russians think almost exactly the same way about us. They are quite distrustful of our motives. Deeply concerned that any kind of agreement that we might sign would simply give us a respite to then regroup and come back at Russia in even more aggressive ways in the future. So the challenge that we face, I think, is not so much, can you imagine on paper some sort of mutual understanding that each side would find as serving its interests. It's the trust problem, I think, is the biggest one. We have an enormous trust problem, some serious perception problems on each side. Those don't go away very easily. And I think if we're going to overcome them, we're going to have to do so with a very conscious effort that it is a problem that needs a solution and requires us to work diplomatically to chip away at that problem over time.
George, this becomes less of a question than an agreement with what you've just said, because it was going to be my next question, and that is the notion that you make in the case in the Harpers article, well, the article coming to terms, that there's a strong case for Russia seeking negotiations, not least because of the fracturing of business with the West and so on, and that's a very reasonable argument. But you also say that sanctions should be suspended but not ended, as it were. And it seems to me that this sense, speaking to your idea of Russia's questioning of our motives and all this, that Russia's sense that sanctions will continue regardless, that regardless of what they do, they existed long before, there was Jackson Vanik got decades ago, and a successor to that, long before the war. And the question of a European security architecture, or even perhaps less structural than that, just simply an agreement or understanding. Russia has 30 years of neglect and sense of neglect, rejection, cynicism over that. Everything from trying to apply for NATO membership to alternatives to NATO itself. And in that regard, Dmitry Trenin's latest statement. Now, we all know Dmitry. I've met him many, many times. We, in fact, at Carnegie helped set up the Moscow office of the endowment. And it's profoundly depressing. Here is a guy who is a true ally of the West, who worked with us, who was reasonable and so on, saying that the declaration of January 22 that nuclear war should not be waged is now obsolete. So, it really, combined with all that, Charles Freeman's latest article, when he says that Ukraine cannot hope to regain at the negotiation table what has been lost on the battlefield. That it just seems that so much of this mutual distrust that you so articulately expressed, it underlies to me the whole prospect for negotiations. Are negotiations a pipe dream, a reality, or somewhere in between?
Well, they're unlikely, I think, is the fair answer to that. The distrust and mutual hostility is just so enormous right now. If I were to put on my analyst hat and say, what is likely, can we anticipate negotiations? The analyst in me says very unlikely, not impossible, but there are some enormous obstacles standing in the way. Now, putting a policy hat on where you talk about, well, what should we do? There I would argue very strongly that it is in our interests in the United States and in the West more broadly to pursue negotiations, because the alternatives are just, much, much worse. And it's easy to see how, we could easily wind up in a decades-long, quite volatile division of Europe if we're not willing to talk and to find some way to reach an understanding going forward that will reduce tensions. And, the alternative to that long-term, very volatile division is escalation into some sort of direct military confrontation between the United States and Russia, which, I shouldn't have to say is quite a nightmarish scenario to contemplate. So are negotiations likely? No, they're not. Should we pursue them? Yes, we should. And I, have not lost hope altogether that the United States is capable of doing very difficult things in the world when it sets its mind to it. And this would be a very difficult task, but I don't think it is beyond our capability to pursue a settlement and find some way to reach some kind of success there. And I don't think the Russians are opposed to it in principle. I think they're just deeply skeptical that we have any interest in doing it.
So you've touched on the obvious lack of trust that exists between the two countries. Perhaps adding to that lack of trust are the events that unfolded in Moscow during the terrorist attack on Crocus City Hall. Analysts like Colonel Larry Wilkerson have been pretty public in their assertions that the Russian leadership and the Russian intelligence services seemed to believe that the U.S. was somehow a mover behind those acts. You know, in your opinion, do you think that they really believe that? And are they wrong?
Well, my perspective on this is colored by my experience at CIA in the run-up to the Iraq War and the aftermath in doing postmortems on what actually happened. And one of the things that experience impressed upon me was that it is very, very common for people in looking at intelligence information, or any data set for that matter, to zero in on pieces of evidence that conform to their expectations. You know, we see what we believe, I think, is the general rule. And there were a lot of people in the US government that were predisposed to believe that Iraq was somehow involved in the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. And it was not as if they made up information. They didn't invent it out of whole cloth. The problem with intelligence oftentimes is, you know, it's all over the map. You get lots of different pieces of data in, and you've got to sort of discriminate between fact and allegation, and you know what really is accurate and what is simply a distraction or even a deception. So there were many people in the US government, including many people in the White House, that sincerely believed that Iraq was connected to al-Qaeda attacks on the United States. So that inclines me to believe that, you know, Russians probably do believe that Ukraine was involved in some way on the concert hall attacks. And I doubt that they're simply making this up, or that this is a cynical effort to advance a deception on Russia's part. My guess is that the normal human bias that we all share toward being drawn toward evidence that conforms with what you expect is probably at work in this case in Russia. Now, do I think this has hurt the broader U.S.-Russian relationship? I think it is reflective of just what a problem we have, is how deep the distrust is between the United States and Russia. Just by way of illustration, back in 2019, if I remember correctly, the U.S. intelligence apparatus shared some terrorist threat information with Russia. We had some information about a looming terrorist attack in St. Petersburg. We shared it with the Russians. The Russians took action. They thwarted the attack and thanked the United States afterwards for that warning. Well, what a contrast that episode is with how this most recent terrorist warning was handled. And I think it is reflective of the depths of the distrust that exists right now between Russia and the United States.
I want to pick a little bit more of this, the matter of negotiations going beyond Ukraine to a larger East-West, one hopes comity at our best, better understanding, dialogue, and so on. And bring in the what's happening in Europe, which to me at the moment can best be termed as perhaps schizophrenic. You've got Macron's new hard line. Basically, Macron, of course, spent several hours on the phone with Putin at the beginning of the war and before the war started, indeed. And now he's basically calling for much more concerted action, level of support for the Ukrainians. And I guess he's being listened at the Baltics. The Poles are on board, and the rest of Europe, Germany less so, obviously. But On the other hand, you've got Joseph Borrell, the chief diplomat of the EU, talking about the need to address the underinvestment in defense industry and military capabilities, and saying that, quote, a high-intensity conventional war in Europe is no longer a fantasy. So even as we're talking, or as some are talking about, let's sit at the negotiation table, you've got this, at very least, it seems, off the reservation element in Europe. What exactly is going on? What's the level of our dialogue with the Europeans at this point? And how helpful is it to your desired outcome of serious negotiations?
Well, there are a lot of moving parts in this relationship right now. There are things going on inside Europe that I think Macron is attempting to address. There are the dynamics of the battlefield situation in Ukraine, and then there are American politics that are at work in all of this. And I think the intersection of all those different pieces is driving what we're seeing right now. And in part, that's why we're seeing some, competing forces, I guess you would say. I'll start with the American side. I think the Europeans can read opinion polls just as well as we Americans can, and they have to be thinking that there is a non-zero possibility that Donald Trump might be back in the White House come next January. And they're asking themselves, I think, what does that mean for the transatlantic relationship? What does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for America's commitment to come to the defense of its allies in Europe should they be attacked? And that in turn, I think, means that the Europeans are starting to think about what would we do if the United States is really not in a leadership role within NATO and is adopting some sort of different approach to the alliance. And I think in that context, France is thinking, well, somebody's going to have to step up. And why shouldn't it be France? And if that's what's driving Macron, then he's got to be thinking, how do I posture in such a way that maximizes France's ability to assume that kind of leadership role? And I think he's got to have his eye on the Eastern Europeans. Who don't trust the Germans and don't believe that there are really any other powers within the EU that are going to come to their rescue if the United States is not going to do that. So I think France is saying, yes, we're willing to do this. Are they serious about putting troops on the ground in Ukraine? That's another matter. I don't know. My guess is not. I think they're probably too smart not to realize that would mean very rapid escalation into a direct military conflict with Russia. And I don't think they're dumb enough to walk into that kind of situation ignorantly. So my guess is that this is political posturing on Macron's part. Now, the point about European defense industry and ramping up manufacturing, obviously it's a huge problem, and it's a problem in the United States as well. We have written checks we can't cash. We've gotten ourselves into a major proxy conflict in this case, but nonetheless, we're dealing with a great power, one with significant military manufacturing capabilities. And our own military manufacturing has atrophied, as the United States has lost overall manufacturing capabilities. That has also applied to military industry. And in a war of attrition with Russia, that puts you at a real disadvantage. So, what has to happen in all of this? Europe is not going to recover its military manufacturing capabilities very quickly. Right. That is something that requires years and years of investment and development. And in the meantime, what do? I think Europe has not yet come to grips with the painful choices it faces. But I think it's quite plain to me that If you're in a confrontation with a country that has much greater military manufacturing capability than you have, you either ought to think twice about escalating into a direct conflict and think hard about finding some sort of settlement, or you recognize you're going to have to sacrifice a fair amount of civilian economic growth and really tighten your belts in order to devote yourselves to the defense buildup that will be required to actually sustain that kind of confrontation. I don't think Europe's ready for it, quite honestly. I don't think they're ready for that kind of painful choice.
Yeah. Well, maybe we just finally say that inside Macron is a de Gaulle eager to get out.
Yeah.
Yes.
The pursuit of grandeur. So, George, as promised, we're going to get you out of here on time. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, George.